If you can blow up those factories like they've hit the Tula ammunition factory, famous AK-47 ammunition factory, um, they've hit that. They haven't destroyed it, but one day we could wake up to that entire facility gone if Ukraine decides to do what they've done on some of these drone raids against the oil industry. They could launch 150 Beaver drones with 90% of them impacting. That's what we're seeing. So when they do that, when they take away the bullets, Russia has to scour the entire former Soviet Union warehouses and ammunition dumps and do what they've done off to the west. They've pulled everything off the Manchuria front. There is no equipment left in the Russian Asia front. If I were Japan, I would start thinking very seriously about maybe a day of imperialism and taking back the Sakhalin Islands. Or if I were China, I would start looking at Siberia as, the next Chinese province because, there's two drunk policemen and a camel out there protecting that.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for TimesRadio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine. And I'm delighted to be joined by Malcolm Nance, an intelligence and foreign policy analyst and a former senior chief petty officer in the US Navy. And in 2022, Malcolm joined the Ukrainian Foreign Legion. Malcolm, it is a pleasure. Welcome to Frontline.
It's my pleasure to be here.
I wonder, first of all, if you can just give us your sense of where we are with things on the ground in Ukraine currently. I know you're still in contact with people in your unit. What are they telling you?
Well, it's still a difficult situation along the entire 1,100 lines, a kilometer line of confrontation where the Russian army main force units are in direct contact and fighting every day with Ukrainian army units. So when you don't hear about the war is still raging, and it's going along the entire line. Now we've added several hundred more square kilometers of line by the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk province in Russia. That's managed to pull quite a few Russian forces off of the front lines in the south. They had to actually remove several regiments and bring them up there because they were having great success against the police forces, the Rozvidka, the militia that were operating there. So that's changed the dynamic of the war. Not that Ukraine wants to invade Russia and take the city of Kursk, but to make Russia think that the entire battlefront is not dictated by the Russian strategic commander Vladimir Putin, and that Ukraine could just as easily take Russian territory, peel off forces, and more importantly, gain a propaganda coup against Russia. Now, the Ukrainian army benefits from this in two ways. One, it removes men off the battlefield with their equipment. Two, it threatens Russia's supply lines. So Ukraine could bring in deep strike systems like high mobility multiple rocket launch system, the HIMARS or the M270 multiple rocket launcher, and can now strike further into the logistics rear of Russia than it could before.
It's a really good point about the Kursk incursion. I've heard some people describe it as a tactical victory, but no more because maybe it hasn't kind of operationally changed things. What is your sense of the effectiveness of the Kursk incursion?
Well, very clearly Vladimir Zelensky did not want to go and take the city of Kursk. He could have. He could have pushed enough resources, time, manpower into that counteroffensive to threaten their nuclear power plant, to take their city, which of course Russia would have reduced that city into rubble. I personally think that he has a plan that we may not all be privy to. And the entire war, I want to point something out to you, is being computer gamed, not just by Ukraine and its strategic command. And when I say computer gamed, I mean literally the tactical variables of every Ukrainian and known Russian unit on the battlefield, where they are, where they're pushing, where their offensives are occurring, where they're weakest, where our intelligence is seeing holes. And we literally can game out an attack. NATO does it in Brussels. The United States does it at our War College in Pennsylvania and Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And this is how we fight wars today. So there clearly was some tactical advantage that moved the dial not just at the tactical level, but at the theater level. which is the entire Russian battlefront. Does that mean that the Ukrainians might have a secret winter offensive that's standing up that we don't know about? When I took part in the Kharkiv counteroffensive in 2022, we knew about 3 weeks before the counteroffensive that we were going to kick off. What we didn't know was the intensity and weight of all the Ukrainian units that were going to participate. We had like 200 tanks show up in a 24-hour period that were not in that sector of operations. And so that throw weight hit the Russians very hard based on the intelligence that we had. And we called it a sledgehammer against glass strategy. In 2023, they didn't have that ability to do that. They pushed along the entire line. So, every sector attacked against the Russians to wear the Russians down. And that's your attrition strategy. Hopefully, the Ukrainians think that at some point there is a weak spot where they can break through. And Russia has, by doing their counterattack this spring in the vicinity of Kharkiv and Volchansk. I have no idea what they're doing. I mean, I fought in that sector. And it was pretty easy for us to fight on ground that we had already taken. And now Russia has lost everything and lost tens of thousands of troops. So when people say, oh, it's a tactical victory is taking ground. Yes. Russia has achieved tactical victories down in the south this year in Avdiivka, Vovchansk, and Popovska, these areas. But just because you move 2 or 3 kilometers does not move the dial on the theater battle map on who could win this war. Ukraine has also used another successful strategy we call head against anvil. And that's when you see Russia dedicate massive amounts of manpower to take a small city or a small town. Bakhmut, Severodonetsk, Avdiivka, all of these come up. And they lose 10,000 men dead, not wounded, right? 10,000 men dead, 20,000 men wounded, hundreds of tanks destroyed. And the Ukrainians have actually capitalized on this. They've turned it into an operational art that NATO strategists are going to be studying for decades. I mean, they have allowed Russia to literally destroy their own army for a kilometer. And that might look great to those Sovietologists, right? The Vladimir Putin, who grew up in the KGB in the Soviet Union, that they're doing the World War II, die for the motherland charges, but you're not doing anything on Ukraine. You're taking a kilometer of land. They're going to get back.
That is fascinating. There is so much to pick up on there, Malcolm. First of all, it was interesting that you said you think that it is feasible we might see some kind of surprise winter offensive by the Ukrainians this winter. Do you think that's into Russia, or do you think that's a counteroffensive in Ukraine, a big counteroffensive?
Well, look, I when I was in Ukraine, I worked first for Ministry of Defense Intelligence, and in late and no, actually, it was in May 2022. I may have opened my mouth up a little early when I suggested that the Ukrainians should do a multi-brigade attack in Kharkiv to cross the Russian border, right where we're at, in Vovchansk, and then cut the supply lines from Volgograd, which is supplying this entire Russian front, and cut the supply lines, threaten them from the south, and destroy the rail lines, run down the main highway, main supply right down there, and get in the rear of Russian forces of Luhansk, just to play with their minds. Well, the Kursk incursion appears to have been done that on one side, but then we started seeing indications that they might threaten Volgograd from the south, right where I said, Vovchansk, and that it would give Ukraine this 1-2 push that could literally deny all of the logistics and supply to Russia's forces. The Russians could, if there was a serious, solid counteroffensive by the Ukrainians, the Russians would have to pull off the Ukrainian battle line to survive. Now, that's bold stroke, right? That's going to take a lot of computer modeling. We're going to have to provide a lot more artillery, multiple rocket launch systems. F-16s will have to come up and give more throw weight in terms of their aerial bombing. But this is a war of logistics. This is as much as it is a war of, putting a bullet into your opponent. And as satisfying as it was, putting bullets into our opponent. It was much more satisfying when I took part in knocking down Russian forces. It was much more satisfying seizing their weapons, ammunition, and vehicles. Because you can't fight a war without bullets. Disgusting as the Russian rations are, you still have to have something to eat. And when they go out and they do these meat attacks, as they call them, these mass soldier suicide attacks, they've still got to have ammunition. And we've seen on the line where soldiers who were conscripted said that they were given 90 rounds of ammunition. Well, I carried 300 rounds. Okay, that's 10 M4 magazines before we got our Bren 2 rifles. 10 M4 magazines at a minimum per man. And when we couldn't get them from the Ukrainians, we bought our own magazines and we loaded up. And then we would take triple the amount of ammunition to resupply. That's because we intend to stay when we fight. The Russians, they send them out and they want them to die, but to die for that 1 meter. So, and how they're going to do that without resupply from these large scale depots is beyond me. But again, Ukraine has been striking some very strategic ammunition manufacturers with their Beaver drones. And if they would get permission from the United States to use some of their deeper range strikes, they could really, really, if people make fun of destroying, logistics warehouses. Why aren't you out killing tanks or bombarding command posts? If you don't have a winter coat, it's really going to be unhealthy for you. But destroying their morale, destroying their ability to feed themselves, destroying their ability to, start looking at that magazine when you get to round number 28 and you're down to two and you're scouring the dead bodies of your comrades for extra bullets. This is how you win a war.
Yeah, let's just expand on that a bit, because it's a point that I think often goes underplayed. The extent to which the Russian casualty rate is just enormous, and you could argue it's sustainable because they're managing just to chuck more men into the meat grinder as
Right.
things stand. But at some point, you would have thought Putin's going to have to do a new mobilization, and is that politically risky for him? But also, as you mentioned, Malcolm, the impact of some of these drone strikes on logistic hubs in Russia. Just expand a bit on that and the impact that's going to have in the long term for Russia.
Right. Well, I have to really take credit, give credit to the Ukrainian intelligence and the land warfare command. For one, thinking about Russia in a way that they understand. They understand Russia the way no NATO planner will ever understand them. They were part of the Soviet system. Their senior commanders were former Soviet officers. One guy that I one guy that I fought with was his call sign Samurai, a Ukrainian army soldier, was former Soviet Spetsnaz commando, right? Naval commando, then Ukrainian naval commando, then Ukrainian army reconnaissance officer. And he understood how they fight. And he'd say, you punch them in the face, they're going to fall back. And you say, okay, at a tactical level, that works. But how does it work over 2 years or 3 years? Ukraine smartly decided to play long ball with how this war was going to go. They were under no misimpression that every counteroffensive would be Kharkiv 22. That was a unique circumstance without the preparation of the battlefield that Russia did. Right after Kharkiv 22, Russia mined, put out obstacles, trench lined every line of that battlefront. So now you have a different war than the first 7 months of the war. You have a trench warfare network. You have anti-tank barrier network. You have the drones now have replaced mortars and hand grenades as the killing machines on the battlefield, and artillery in some respect. So as a strategic planner for, Ukrainian intelligence and their, armed forces command, you have to think, how does my enemy get artillery shells? Well, we saw that in 2023, Russia did suffer a starvation of artillery shells. But also in 2023, the counteroffensive that everyone felt disappointed with, right? I met Minister Reznikov, who was the defense minister at that time. Very interesting. He had never met an international legionnaire, even though he had thousands under his belt operationally. And he said, What you did before is going to be very different this year. This year, we're going to punch them everywhere. We're going to do body blows. And that was a smart strategy. But before they ever threw an armor assault, they spent almost 2 months killing every Russian artillery tube, every Russian artillery battery that they could find. And that's because when the war started, Russia had what we would call strategic, not even tactical or theater. They had strategic overmatch on artillery. And, some pundits say 12 to 1, 20 to 1 on rocket tubes, that all of these things that were in warehouses in the Soviet Union. Well, Ukraine had strategic overmatch as well. Ukraine had strategic overmatch in guts. And that's what sustained the Ukrainian army. They were well prepared for the Russians to invade. They spent weeks before the invasion on the battlefront taking out all of their war stocks. They understood artillery was coming. And they went on this massive campaign that lasted 2 months in 2023. If you went near an artillery battery, you were bombarded. They used U.S. counter battery fire radars, used their own drone system to gather real time visual intelligence. They have a very intense, real time, brigade level, persistent surveillance network of drones out there that to see everything, every movement. Marry that up with U.S. intelligence. From Defense Intelligence Agency or National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, all of the combined intelligence resources of NATO looking back into Russia. So when you go to these, and we have some excellent open source intelligence people who are looking at all of the warehouses and storage facilities of like every self-propelled gun in Russia and watching them being repaired and drawn out and sent to the front and then visually seeing them destroyed showed that Russia's logistics base, the nation itself, this isn't World War II with, little old ladies in Vladivostok packing, first aid kits that are going to the Murmansk front, right? Or the Kursk front against the Germans. This is not that. That nation has not mobilized for war because now they have money, they have a middle class, they have an opinion and the ability to influence government. They don't have to live in fear from a Joseph Stalin. So Ukraine understands that. And that means there will be one oligarch's factory that makes medical kits. There will be one or two that will stuff meals ready to eat, right? And then there will be two or three ammunition factories that make all of the ammunition for Russia. And if you can blow up those factories like they've hit the Tula ammunition factory, famous AK-47 ammunition factory, they've hit that, they haven't destroyed it. But one day we could wake up to that entire facility gone if Ukraine decides to do what they've done on some of these drone raids against the oil industry. They could launch 150 Beaver drones with 90% of them impacting. That's what we're seeing. So when they do that, when they take away the bullets, Russia has to scour the entire former Soviet Union warehouses and ammunition dumps and do what they've done off to the west. They've pulled everything off the Manchuria front. There is no equipment left in the Russian Asia front. If I were Japan, I would start thinking very seriously about maybe a day of imperialism and taking back the Sakhalin Islands. Or if I were China, I would start looking at Siberia as the next Chinese province because there's two drunk policemen and a camel out there protecting that. Everything else has moved to the Ukrainian front. Ukraine has so drained Russia that again, war is your willpower and your logistics power to sustain combat. Russia, I understand now, is spending 40% of its national budget on this war. And that means, okay, 30% are going into oligarchs' pockets. So what's happening is those bullets are not arriving on the Ukrainian front.
Malcolm, just finally, I mentioned at the start of this interview that in 2022 you took the decision to join the Ukrainian Foreign Legion.
Right.
Can you just remind us of your motivation for doing that? Because my worry, here we are 2.5 years on, or over that now, from the full-scale invasion beginning, that in the West sometimes we forget the instinctive reaction we had to Putin's illegal invasion. And I just wonder if you can speak a bit about that.
Yeah, I think that it's very true that due to this war going on so long, the attrition. Another thing is Westerners are not used to World War II style wars going on for longer than a week or two. They think Azerbaijan or Libya or some of these short term high intensity combat operations. This ain't the Middle East. I have fought in every Middle East war there has been since 1983, starting in Lebanon, 1983, where we have not just air superiority, air supremacy, where we have uninhibited logistics. We launched B-2 bombers from Kansas to strike Afghanistan, and then they land in Japan. So, I mean, we have literally strategic throw weight that can circumnavigate the globe to drop 2 or 3 precision, high altitude weapon systems. This is not what Ukraine is. What I saw in the run up to the Ukrainian invasion, I went to Ukraine to see for myself the invasion routes. I was doing a study for a think tank. I wanted to see how Russia would be able to do it. What roads would they have to come down? What were the conditions of those roads? What were the intersections like? I found, when I went from, Sumy to Kiev, there were like maybe 30 major intersections with gas stations, like the Oko gas station network or the Sokar gas stations that were just the best convenience stores in all of Europe, right? Just no question. Like it's like invading, a Carrefour or something like that with a gas pump, but an entire wall of liquor, literally just hundreds and hundreds of bottles of liquor per shop. And I realized this is going to slow this invasion down by weeks. The Russians are thieves. The Russians are drunks. All right. George Patton himself said this in 1945, right? Uh, but I didn't believe it until the invasion started and they started looting liquor stores and the amounts of alcohol we found. But what I was most offended by is that in 2022, in the first quarter of the 21st century, that someone can decide to act like both a Stalin and Hitler in the same breath and just decide, I'm seizing 1/4 of the world's wheat exports. I'm going to seize the entire former technological hub of the Soviet Union, because that's what Ukraine was. They built the ballistic missiles for the atomic bombs, atomic bomb warheads. The naval vessels and all of their advanced missile systems were built in Ukraine. Putin got it into his head that he could get this in a matter of days. And
Yeah.
what he forgot was these people will fight. So that being said, I joined the International Legion when people I had met there were calling me, telling me they were going to die. And I when President Zelensky asked for international volunteers, I was 60 years old at the time. I had a depth of almost 40 years of intelligence and operational combat experience. And I said, I'm going to help. So I went there. I worked with defense intelligence. Then I went to an infantry battalion, and then went into a special operations battalion, and really tried to help do what little I could. But combat at age 62 is not what it is. I'm sorry, age 61 when I went into the offensive.
Yeah.
It's not the same. But it was the
Well,
Ardennes Forest of 1944. It was
yeah.
not Libya.
Well, Malcolm, we really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us on Frontline.
It is truly my pleasure to be here.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.